Hey everyone, dear Sky Gods, fans, potential fans, future fans, fans of the past. I just want to give you an update on what's been happening. This has been a very tumultuous, let's call it a year so far, since I've really started working intensely on the project and quite some other projects too. I want to give you an update on what has worked, what has not worked, and where the potential problems are. Going back to my very earliest videos, we're talking about 6-7 years back. This was a very, very different environment. Streaming was essentially still a thing, even for independent animators or filmmakers, which really isn't a thing anymore these days. And the one thing that I've really struggled, and that's sort of like to those, and I'm just gonna get that big elephant out of the room, for those of you who've been sending me text messages, well, you said years ago, why is this not happening, blah, blah, blah. It is not happening because there is no end point. When you make a project, then you have to have a point of where is it going to get out to the people, how is it going to get out to the people, and how is it monetized so you can continue. And I've talked about this before. There's been sort of the consistent struggle, not only of myself, but most other independent animators, independent filmmakers in general. This has been the number one problem, that the rates that the streaming services are paying have been declining quite dramatically over the years. I've mentioned that before, that when Amazon Prime started, about 10 years ago, they used to pay about 10 cents per streamed hour, and now they're basically down to a half a cent if they even take your project. So you really essentially have to be able to create the majority of the project up front. And I thought that would actually be a good idea, and I've also said that I can do this by myself, which I could. However, life has also become exponentially more expensive, and it doesn't have help that I'm probably living in the most expensive country in the world. So just this year alone, the cost of living has been pretty much increased by about 20 to 30%. It is absolutely mind-numbing, and that's caused some problems. At the same time, there has been other developments, like for example, at a conference about 4 or 5 years ago, somebody mentioned, well, why don't you make a game? This sounds like it would be a really cool game. And I've really, for the last 2 or 3 years, I've really gotten heavy into game production, game development, all of those kind of things, because games are something that is a little bit more structured than, let's say, video production or video distribution, stuff like that. You can essentially make a game. If your game is good enough, you can put it on Steam, and you do have a market there. People are willing to pay for a game more so than for an animated movie or an animated show. And I always liked the idea of and I've talked about this before, that Sky Gods would be more than just an anime. It would be a webtoon, it would be a graphic novel, it would be a potential game. And the more I got into game development, basically, the more I liked it. That would include learning more about 3D production, learning Unity engine, and so on and so on. And at the same time, I was also working on 2 or 3 other projects, just sort of to keep sort of the learning curve a little bit separate. And I am at this point have 3 active projects. There's one project that got done a little faster. That's a vampire horror game called Immortal Coil. That is actually going to be ready to be launched on Steam within the next 3 to 4 months. So that has been quite acclaimed. Now for that, this is my first game. People are like, wow, this actually looks really super good and stuff like that. And with Sky Gods, it was sort of the situation that I have these sort of a 2-part. When you go on a website, you have Sky Gods Stargazer, and you have Sky Gods Tales. And Sky Gods Tales was going to be the smaller stories from around the universe, small quotation marks. And Stargazer was going to be the original ancient aliens influenced Anunnaki, kind of playing here on Earth kind of storyline, basically. That was always supposed to be the animated series. So I started basically working on retooling the animated series also into a game. So you basically will be playing the game as sort of a Starseed hybrid that wakes up, and you sort of have to go around to those various ancient sites here, like Babylon, Egypt, Mu, and all those sort of mythical places, basically, to find your way basically back home. And while you do that, you encounter all kinds of various alien fractions that basically have been living on Earth and sort of like been colonializing Earth. But of course, that would be before our history, you know. That sounded like a really interesting concept. That would also sort of tie into the animated series. So that's sort of like the path I'm gonna go down. So I'm gonna try to get funding for the game, which seems to be somewhat easier than funding for an animated series. You know, I'm gonna repeat again. You know, it was not for the lack of trying. I've talked to a lot of people. I've talked to a lot of people in the movie industry, in the streaming industry. And what I've been told over and over again is essentially like, well, if it's not like Star Wars, it's not like Star Trek, we're not really that interested, you know. So this is sort of like the alternative way of telling science fiction fantasy stories is not really something that the mainstream media is interested. So it's really something that has to come basically from the ground up, and it has to, one way or another, it has to be financed somehow, you know. And I think if their game was financed and would be successful, that will make everything a lot easier. And especially if I can sort of like in the beginning also tell the games people that, like, well, you know, there's an animated series in production, and there will probably be anime cutscenes in the game, and there will be an anime trailer for the game. So it's sort of like it all sort of goes in one, you know. And then I think the anime series could then piggyback basically on the game, because the game is not easier to make. It's probably harder to make than the anime series, you know, quite frankly. But it is financially something that will be sustainable, and the project could get off the ground. So has been a lot of trial and errors, you know. Obviously I've tried some alternative ways, you know. I've tried to like finance this through Web3 activities, and I had to stop this in July. You know, this is very, very detrimental to me basically, because I've built a lot of stuff in that space, but I had to stop because the scamming and spamming and just general thievery of that kind of space just really got to me, you know. And it is unfortunate because I do like the technology, and I do think this technology actually has a really good future. I just don't think it's gonna happen the way it is happening right now. You know, there's just too many people in this space that just want to extract value, and you just cannot do that. You also have to add value, you know. And there's a lot of good people here working in this space that add technical value, but they don't really add monetary value, and it's just still too much about speculation. And I know a lot of people have been sort of tried this, like also in the movie space and the comic book space and stuff like that. It sort of reminds me of the early days of the internet, you know. I mean, for those of you who have been around long enough, remember the early days of like the early entertainment websites of the internet that tried to sort of like create flash animations and flash games. I'm not talking about Newgrounds, but I'm talking about Shockwave and some of the other ones I just forgot basically. Icebox, for example, would have been one. And it's sort of like the quest of those sites or marketplaces to find a way to sort of monetize entertainment on the internet, and it just was not working, you know, because for a variety of reasons, you know, the technology wasn't there, the download speed was too slow. There's a lot of reasons why it didn't work basically. And then, like, you know, even like a company like Enron, for example, basically on the very last deathbed moment, they had the idea of sort of creating a streaming service, aka Netflix, but 15 years before Netflix did it, and it wasn't working because it was just too early. And that's kind of like how I see it with the Web3 space. I think the technology is interesting because it is peer-to-peer trading. You know, let's not forget that there's no credit card transactions, there's no like 10 people earning money on whatever you're selling basically. So it's actually for content creators, or like people want to create stuff and directly sell it to their customer. This is a very attractive proposition, but the space is not mature enough for this to happen. So it is mostly just like some financial stuff, maybe a lot of scamming, a lot of rug pulling, and all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of disappointing. But listen guys, I just want to quickly give you this update. As you see on social media, I'm still creating new stuff. I'm posting regularly basically. The next thing to happen is essentially I made a complete redesign of the Anunnaki costumes, you know, and creating new art basically, and that sort of like also creating a little more edgier style, a little less retro-ish. I mean, in the beginning when I started, you know, it's been pointed out to me many times, and it's fair game. It's a very retro style basically, because I like the early 90s Japanese animation style. But now we're trying to be a little bit more modern, so I redesigned the costume basically, also like in what do you call it, for preparation of the game document, you know. So I really want to have a little more edgier style, maybe a little bit like the game Hades, you know, sort of like an anime influenced style, but a little more edgy, a little bit maybe more Americanized. And I'll be posting more updates on that. And yeah, please, you know, don't give up on it yet. You know, I'm certainly not giving up on it yet, and we will get this done one way or another. It's not going to take another 10 years or something like that, but I think within the next year or so we'll most definitely going to get movement going on a game, and the game trailers, and you will see the first animation stuff, and then probably the game will probably take about a year to develop once I get funding. And yeah, so by 2026, you know, almost the 10-year anniversary of the project, we'll probably finally get to see something good. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.